Hello, I'm Alison Johnstone. I'm currently in the Dewar room in the Scottish Parliament with Professor Kezia Dugdale, and we're going to have a good discussion this afternoon about issues affecting all of us in politics, really.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me back.
You too. Well, I feel you're a very welcome and frequent visitor, and it's nice to have you around and about. I think still putting your expertise and knowledge to very good use.
Not too frequent, I hope. You don't want people who never really properly go away after they leave Parliament. So I just picked my moments, and it's a pleasure to have one with you today.
Well, it's lovely to have you here. How are things with you?
Good, yeah. So I'm nearly 7 years out of being a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I've spent the last 7 years at the University of Glasgow in a much more academic role. So a big part of what I do now is helping academics from across the University of Glasgow and across Scotland have greater impact with their research, trying to find ways to use their ideas and their findings in a way that can inform and shape politics to hopefully enhance the quality of debate that happens in this building.
And when you left initially, you went to the John Smith Centre, and it's fair to say that we still have very close links and a great internship programme.
The Parliament's been a huge supporter of the John Smith Centre, so this is a cross-party initiative to try and get more young people engaged in politics and to create more opportunities for young people to get direct first-hand experience of what it's like to work in politics, either as a politician or working in the office of an MSP, doing casework, or working on a particular policy or idea with structured, meaningful, well-paid internships in this building. So that's been going for several years now, and I hear it's growing from strength to strength.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that the Parliament does whatever it can to provide opportunities. I think particularly for people who might find it hard to access this world, which can seem quite difficult to get involved in.
Definitely. And you and I were elected at the same time, and I don't know if you would kind of share this memory, but for me, when I first was elected here, I was really struck by how familial a lot of relationships in politics can be. So the people who were getting opportunities to get work experience in this building, more often than not, were there because they had a connection to someone. You know, somebody worked for somebody, or somebody's mum knew somebody's dad. And if you didn't have those connections in life, you could look at the Parliament and have no idea how to get through the front door, let alone into one of the offices behind the scenes. So hopefully schemes like the John Smith Centre break that down and open it up. And the critical part of it, of course, is that you get paid for your efforts.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that the Parliament is wholly representative of the people of Scotland, and that'll never happen if people feel excluded or that it's not for them. I mean, I didn't get involved in politics until I was in my 30s, campaigning to save a school playing field.
Yeah.
And I never thought I'd find myself here, but probably I would have looked at it from afar and thought that's very interesting. But my own experience has just so convinced me of the need to make sure that everyone knows that they need to be involved and that we need to hear everyone's voices.
I also think that your journey into politics is like the perfect one. It's the one that you want people to sort of see and believe as possible, so that you can, as you've just described, get involved in a local community activity or project where you live. And that switches a light on about like the potential that politics can deliver. And you just went from that local community group to stand for the council, to stand to become an MSP, and now you rule the roost in here.
Well, it's certainly been unplanned and never a dull moment, and always challenging. Yeah. But I think I've found throughout incredibly interesting, very, very privileged position. To represent people in your local community is always a privilege and a huge responsibility, whether it's in local government or national government, or now, working hard to make sure I'm doing the very best to enable all my colleagues in Parliament to optimally represent their communities.
I don't miss being an MSP much, but the bit I do miss is that bit with actual people, the people that you would meet in your surgeries or out and about, where they share something that's really significant about their own life, whether it's a problem or a challenge or sometimes a positive experience, and they want you to know about it to help inform what happens to other people and decisions that are taken in this place. That's a kind of privilege and an honour I've never lost sight of.
Yeah, no, that's really lovely to hear, and I think it is the main attraction for everyone who gets involved. You've got constituents contacting you constantly, whether it's by email or phoning, just people looking for help, and that is the great privilege of this role. From where you are now, Kezia, do you see any differences in the political environment, perhaps? I mean, you've not been away that long, really, but is there anything you've noticed has changed from where you are?
So I get asked all the time, how do you feel now you've left politics? And I always say, well, I don't really feel like I have left. I've left elected politics, but, I still follow it every day. I write about it every week. I've got a column in a newspaper, and I'm on the radio every week talking about politics. So it's still like in my blood. It's, I'm always going to live and breathe that. So as quite a serious kind of watcher of it, spectator of it, I do have a few reflections, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but I do feel like the tenor of the political debate is really soured in the last 5 years. I think political parties are less tolerant of each other than they were when I was around. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a second, when it was me, Ruth Davidson and Nicola Sturgeon, it was a land of milk and honey and we were all best friends, because it was far from that. Of course it was. But I think we had a better understanding then and respect for each other's respective positions or ideologies or kind of outlook in life. We didn't question each other's motives. And now I feel like in the past 5 years, I've seen politicians in this building, not exclusively here, it's happening across the globe. It's a product of global populism, actually, when you look at the theory of it. Just that sense of it all getting a bit more personal, a bit more emotive, a bit less rational. And we're starting to question each other's motives. I think every single MSP in this building is here because they want to contribute to their country. They see themselves as public servants. You've got to start from that good faith perspective.
Yeah, you absolutely do. I think obviously I've done some work in recent times with the Joe Cox Civility Commission, because look at what can happen if things go so very, very badly wrong that elected representatives are, quite frankly, being murdered, while they're going about their work. And that really does make you just step back and think, hang on a minute, look at the level of polarisation where holding different views leads to such shocking tragedy. So we do all have to speak about this, and how we discuss issues really, really matters. I've always been determined that people should be able to disagree wholeheartedly and entirely with someone else's point of view, but to actually, you should still be able to go and have a polite conversation afterwards and just say, I realise these are your political positions, but we are here as fellow representatives, and we want to work together, as often does happen, of course, collaboratively across those other issues. There's a challenge too, obviously we have conduct that we want to see in Parliament, and that is, there's a tension there when people are very robust and very passionate. We don't want to lose that passion for debate, but we have to do it within the constraints of a discourse that lets people hear, lets those who've come to the gallery or are watching from outside understand our arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to embarrass you, but I think you've done a tremendous job of this over the past 5 years in that chair as presiding officer, because you've conducted yourself in that chair exactly as you conducted yourself as an MSP, which was with that tolerance and respect and willingness to listen. And I think when we think about, the tenor of debate and how it's declined, there's a lot of work to do to try and overcome that and make it better for what happens in the next 5 years. But there's also something we need to do to protect the people who are looking in on that and deciding right now whether politics is something for them. Because I really worry that people look at the current febrile nature of how people do politics and go, the last thing I want to do is to step into that arena. Because I think what we lose sight of sometimes is that bit of FMQs you see on the telly on a Thursday, that is a fraction of what an MSP does. It's literally like, seconds or minutes of, quite a long week over a long year, over a long 5-year session. There's so much more to the job than what you see of politicians sparring against each other in the chamber, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you'll know, obviously, having been in there and taken part in FMQs week after week, month after month, obviously there's prep goes into that. That session gets a lot of focus. Here we have the First Minister of the country and opposition leaders, scrutinising the government very robustly. And it can sometimes seem quite theatrical, which I think for a lot of people is really interesting and almost entertaining, where there's all the hard work that goes into preparation for debates and preparation for committee meetings on a whole range of issues, on pieces of legislation that might not be so well known. But we want people to watch and think, actually, that looks really interesting, that really appeals to me. And sometimes when things look hostile, that can put people off.
Yeah. but it's not anything like the full picture of what the job is like.
No, it isn't at all. I mean, I think the job description of a Member of Parliament is, you know, it's wide-ranging and it is demanding and challenging. You want to be making sure that people are attracted to it.
I always say to people, especially in the current climate, where you have to be honest and say, it is a taller order right now to ask people to step up and be local representatives. There's no point shying away from that, but it is absolutely worth it. It's worth it in terms of the satisfaction you'll get on a selfish basis about, you know, being a representative of the people and the difference that you can make with that. But also it's so worth it in terms of the decisions this building takes day in, day out, which materially improve the lives of people in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything from your current role that you'd like to see change? I mean, obviously Parliament collaborates with a whole range of institutions and organisations.
Yeah.
You know, we're working with individuals, we're working with schools, universities. We've got a great education programme here that I think is really important. You know, imagine having the opportunity in primary 6 or 7 to come and chat to your elected representatives. Is there anything you'd like to see us improve on?
So all of that is fantastic. So bank that and do more of that, please. I think we'll take that as a given. So I work now around really complex areas of public policy. So big wicked challenges would be the term, where it's not just a simple area of, you know, education policy or health policy. It's big ideas or big challenges that sit across a number of different areas. You think about climate change. That's not just an environmental issue now for the Environment Committee. That's an issue to do with transport, it's to do with housing, it's to do with water, it's to do with heat. It's all these different parts of people's lives. Equally, when we think about things like poverty, you can't just park the idea of poverty in one parliamentary committee and say it belongs there. It's relevant to so many different areas of work. And I think one area I would really like the Parliament to get more serious about than it's currently been able to devote a lot of time to is how we scrutinise really complex, wicked challenges like poverty or climate change across a number of different parliamentary structures and committees. And I always thought that the conveners group might be a place that did more of that. So the idea being you to have super committees of the conveners from the different parliamentary committees coming together to really study a particular issue, like public service reform, for example. We know that the next parliamentary session is going to be against a backdrop of a really difficult financial settlement. Like, there are going to have to be huge reforms, quite likely significant cuts to the things that we probably take for granted now. Is the Parliament really ready for that type of conversation? Really difficult decisions coming ahead? I'd be kicking the tyres of that a wee bit.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know the conveners group do a lot of work together and there's certainly more focus on that cross-cutting approach. Obviously, the Parliament's had its own Futures Forum for some time, trying to look beyond the next electoral cycle, and there's been some revisions there to how that will work in future to make sure it remains as effective as possible. But undoubtedly, there's challenges there. I mean, you'll know that in recent times we've had some fairly late nights, we have a lot of legislation to get through, and I think it's important that you always take time to just step back and think, are we working as optimally as we could, and what might make a difference to making sure that scrutiny is as effective as it can be. I mean, there's been an inquiry into the effectiveness of committees more generally, and I think soon we'll see a move to elected conveners. You know, there's discussion there about whether or not it's time to make that change, and it seems pretty much that is the road Parliament will take.
So you've witnessed a lot of parliamentary business in the last 5 years from that chair, and you've introduced quite a few reforms yourself. So I don't think when I was here urgent questions existed, and you certainly used topical questions more frequently than I remember them. But like, are you happy with the progress that you've made in that regard, or are there some tweaks you'd still like to make? Yeah,
there's definitely some progress that I think is attainable and probably fairly easily. I think you're right, Tricia Marwick introduced topical questions, so that was some progress there. And I think urgent questions came in during session 5, but I've made a great deal more use of those. And I think the news cycle is ever faster. Social media wasn't around in those early days. You know, members are using that all the time. So we need to be more responsive as a Parliament. And I think if we were given a blank sheet of paper now, it would look markedly, well, there'd be differences with what we proposed in 1999, which still forms the basic skeleton of the parliamentary week. I think in particular having an open daily questions session would be very much welcomed by members, because currently we have deadlines for specific things on certain days, and by the time you reach the day, the news cycle might have changed, and then there'll be a requirement for an urgent question, which means business is lengthened and delayed, which can impact on those with caring responsibilities. There's a lot we could do quite easily, so I think a daily question session that doesn't have those deadlines. I think lengthening question sessions that are already there, you know, if it's an education portfolio or a health portfolio, just add a little extra time on the end for free-flowing questions that haven't already been lodged. You know, there's stuff like that. Just look at the deadlines that we have currently and see whether they could be made a bit more flexible, because all of this means that the Parliament is more relevant and responsive to the issues that concern our constituents.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think there's lots of examples from other jurisdictions where ministers can expect to be called in to respond to the latest development on a given issue, and if the news cycle's changing, then Parliament's got to change too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even for, you know, governments, it means they know this session is there every day rather than something cropping up that's unexpected. So I think it just benefits democracy generally.
I wanted to ask you about some of those late night votes, because I remember being one of the people who was encouraging you to think about being presiding officer last time around, so apologies if that was advice you might be now regretting. But I remember having conversations with you because you did so much work, and we did some work together in the Women 50-50 campaign, thinking about how we get more women in particular to stand here, and we both knew and understood that the kind of lifestyle that comes with a politician is not necessarily compatible to a traditional idea of family life, right? So when I've been witnessing the Parliament sitting really late into the evening, I've been going, but I know the presiding officer really doesn't want that to happen, but it's not entirely within your control, is it?
It's not. I mean, it certainly isn't. And,
or even nearly in your control.
No, I mean, and I have, we've had a, you know, these are challenging. These are challenging roles in an environment that can be challenging, but I'm always very grateful to your support and encouragement. With regards, you get to this stage in the electoral cycle, we're coming up hard and fast against dissolution and the end of this session of Parliament. There's legislation that still has to pass. So business managers from each party get together. They're a group that we call the Bureau.
So you're going to say the boys, but no, the Bureau.
Well, actually, I think it's fair to say that where there hasn't been a woman presiding officer, it would probably be very unusual that there would be more than one woman on that group. You know, it does seem to have been very strongly a male body. I think it's time that we look at changing that. The gender sensitive audit, a Parliament for All, the audit that we undertook, looked at how we might go about changing that. It's fair to say we've made progress with having some recommendations implemented, but not all of the ones I would have liked to see. For example, that one that would have brought about maybe a greater change in the membership of those structures, because it's so important if you want the Parliament to be representative of the people of Scotland. So the people that are in the room taking all these decisions on these various matters should be as representative as possible. And I don't think we're there yet. There's still some work to do.
I think there was a moment, and it must be nearly 10 years ago, I couldn't put my exact finger on it, when all of the Bureau and all of the corporate body were made up of male MSPs. So that meant every decision about the business that was taking place and every decision about how the Parliament was run was being taken by men. And I remember kind of crusading against that, and the product of me crusading against that was that I ended up in the corporate body for the latter years of my time in the Parliament, and I really enjoyed that, because I started to see, you know, what it takes behind the scenes for the Parliament to function. But having a rule like, you know, a baseline of ensuring there are women in the room when it comes to deciding the order of business and how the Parliament is run, and dare I say it, even make-up of committees, surely can't be beyond a Parliament that wants to be fit for the modern world.
No, absolutely. And we've worked really hard. You know, the gender sensitive audit, this Parliament for All, has been undertaken by a cross-party group of MSPs. There's an advisory group now looking to make sure that the 34 recommendations don't just end up on a shelf and nobody ever pays any attention to them ever again. I'm really determined that whoever follows me in this role has that from day one and really commits to it, because it can drive change. We've been fortunate enough to see, you know, some developments. The corporate body this session is largely made up of women. So that's really good, and you're absolutely right. You'll learn so much from being on the corporate body about how the Parliament runs, and it'd be great if that opportunity were afforded to to a more diverse group of MSPs, because
So
it does matter. Because we're looking at things like, childcare in the
Yeah.
Parliament, and how can we improve on that? Because that offering there, we have looked at that a lot this session, and we'll be, just about to finalise our report on what we've done and where we've got it to. But, this is a demanding weekly workload, and it can involve folk leaving home on Sunday or Monday and not heading back till Friday. So we've got to do everything we can to make sure that it fits with people's lifestyles and they can see themselves doing it.
And it's not a selfish ask. It's not about the individual needs of MSPs. It's about, we know from the evidence that a more equal Parliament makes better policy and better reflects the country that it seeks to represent. So equality and having women in these committees and in these roles delivers for everyone. Yeah,
absolutely. I think I thought, well, probably the night before I put myself forward for this post, I thought I wasn't going to. I really did think no. And it was just, a conversation that I had with a couple of people. I thought, well, actually, if I'm committed to making sure that women are in these visible positions, this is really important. And, I've been really touched by the number of young women who have told me that it's made a great difference to them. And, I've just chatted to so many of them over these 5 years, and I hope that it does enable them to imagine that they too could follow in our footsteps and get involved, because we are yet to attain a 50-50 Parliament. This session I found myself thinking, oh, amazing, 45% women. And I thought, what am I doing?
Yeah.
We shouldn't really be thinking, isn't that amazing? But we've been as low down as low 30s here, and who knows what the forthcoming election will do in terms of that return and equal representation. And it's not just about being represented in Parliament, it's about making sure, as is currently the case, that we have women in important positions as committee conveners. It's fair to say, since your day has changed, I think I've only ever called one women party leader to speak. So that's been actually two. So, we can't just assume that all progress is linear, because it can shrink back. And, you've spoken yourself there about the tall order it would be currently to get involved.
Well, I, for one, would just like to say thank you for deciding to stand the night before the presiding officer elections, and for everything that you've done over the past 5 years.
That is very, very kind of you, and we're just immensely grateful to you. I think you bring a lot to our politics, Kezia, and you'll be always welcome here in the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you.